Grace Carter leaned heavily against the nurse's station, the weight of a 12-hour shift pulling at her shoulders. The usual bustle of Cityview General Hospital had finally started to die down. The beeping of monitors, hurried footsteps, and muted conversations were giving way to a rare stillness as the evening settled in. She sighed deeply, glancing at the clock on the wall. 7:45 p.m. Her shift had officially ended 15 minutes ago, but the pile of paperwork waiting in her clipboard suggested she wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. Grace adjusted her badge and rubbed the back of her neck, contemplating whether she could justify leaving the rest of the charts for the next nurse. Her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed an elderly man sitting in the waiting area. His silver hair caught the light, and his hunched posture seemed to echo the weariness etched into his deeply lined face. She hesitated for a moment. Most patients had left by now, either escorted out by family or discharged earlier in the evening. This man was alone, his cane resting against his leg as his hands fidgeted with a worn cap. Something about the scene tugged at Grace, her instinct to help overriding her exhaustion. Grace walked over, her sneakers squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently. "Are you waiting for someone?" The man looked up, startled by her presence. His hazel eyes were clouded with worry. "Ah, yes. At least I was," he said hesitantly, his voice hoarse but steady. "What's your name?" Grace asked, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. "Henry Wallace," he replied, gripping his cap tighter. "Well, Mr. Wallace, let's see if we can figure this out together," Grace said, offering a warm smile. "Do you have someone coming to pick you up?" Henry sighed, his shoulders slumping further. "I thought so. But my ride didn't show, and my phone's dead. I don't know what to do." Grace frowned. "Do you have anyone else I can call for you? Family or a friend?" Henry shook his head. "No one close by. My daughter, Emily, she's far away. We haven't talked much in years." The admission hung in the air, tinged with regret. Grace nodded, sensing that Henry wasn't just lost physically but emotionally, too. "What about a cab?" she offered. I left my wallet at home," Henry admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I wasn't planning to need it." Grace's heart clenched. She could see the frustration in his eyes, the quiet dignity of a man who was unused to asking for help but had no other choice. She straightened up, making a quick decision. "Tell you what, Mr. Wallace. My shift's over, but I'll stay and help you get home. How does that sound?" Henry blinked at her in surprise. "You don't have to do that, young lady. You've probably got family waiting for you." Grace chuckled softly. "Just a goldfish and a takeout menu. Let me help, Mr. Wallace. It's no trouble." The drive to Henry's house was quiet at first, the soft hum of the car's engine filling the space. Grace stole glances at him from time to time. He held his cane tightly, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "You mentioned your daughter," Grace said gently, breaking the silence. "What's her name?" "Emily," Henry replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's a good woman. Always has been. We haven't seen eye to eye since her mother passed." Grace nodded, letting the words settle. "I'm sorry to hear that. Losing someone you love, it changes everything, doesn't it?" "It does," Henry said, his tone heavy with regret. "Margaret was the glue that held us all together. When she was gone, I didn't know how to keep things right. I pushed Emily away without meaning to." Grace's heart ached for him. She could hear the pain in his voice, the longing for a connection he thought was lost forever. When they arrived at Henry's home, Grace took in the sight of the modest house. The paint on the shutters was peeling, and the yard was overgrown, a testament to the challenges Henry must have been facing alone. "Let me help you inside," she said as she parked the car. Henry hesitated but nodded, his movements slow and deliberate as he stepped out of the car. Inside, the house was quiet, almost too quiet. Dust coated the furniture, and unopened mail piled on the small dining table. Grace noticed a box of crackers and a few cans of soup on the kitchen counter, their presence hinting at a diet far too sparse. "Mr. Wallace," she began gently, "have you been eating properly?" Henry chuckled dryly, though there was little humor in it. "A man my age doesn't need much." Grace shook her head. "Everyone needs enough. How about I make you something before I go?" Henry waved a hand dismissively. "You've done more than enough already. I'll be fine." "I insist," Grace said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. She heated a can of soup, setting the steaming bowl in front of him at the table. Henry ate slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the spoon. Grace busied herself tidying up the kitchen, her nurse's instincts kicking in. As she cleared a stack of unopened mail, one envelope caught her attention. It bore the logo of the hospital. "Mr. Wallace," she said, holding up the envelope, "is this from us?" Henry looked up, his expression clouding with unease. "It might be. I haven't gotten around to opening the mail." Grace hesitated, then asked, "Do you mind if I take a look? Just to make sure it's nothing urgent." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging as though bracing himself for bad news. Grace opened the envelope, her trained eyes scanning the document quickly. Her heart sank as she read the contents. "Mr. Wallace," she said softly, "this letter says you need to come back for further testing. It's important." Henry sighed deeply, his face etched with worry. "I figured it might be something like that," he admitted. "But what's the point? I'm an old man. What could they do for me that's worth all the trouble?" Grace crouched beside him, her voice steady but warm. "They can do a lot for you, but only if you let them. You deserve to feel better, Mr. Wallace. You deserve a chance to live your life fully." Henry stared at her, his eyes filled with doubt and something else, a flicker of hope. After a moment, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "If you think it's worth it, I'll go. I'll help you every step of the way," Grace promised. "You're not alone in this." As she prepared to leave, Grace felt a strange sense of purpose. Helping Henry had started as a simple act of kindness, but it had become something more, a chance to make a real difference. She glanced back at him before closing the door, her heart swelling with determination. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Grace arrived at Henry's house, a sense of determination driving her as she parked in the cracked driveway. She had spent part of the night thinking about Henry, his quiet struggles, and the unopened hospital letter that had sparked their conversation. She wasn't sure what had compelled her to get so involved, but something about Henry felt different. When she knocked on the door, there was a long pause before it creaked open. Henry stood there in his usual cardigan and slacks, his cane in one hand, his face lit up with surprise when he saw her. "Grace," he said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I thought I'd check in and make sure you were ready for your appointment," she said with a smile, holding up a thermos. "And I brought coffee. Figured you might need a boost." Henry chuckled, stepping aside to let her in. "You're too kind. Most people would have left me to fend for myself." "That's not my style," she replied, handing him the thermos and setting her bag down on the counter. Grace spent the next hour helping Henry get ready for the day. She made a quick breakfast, insisting he eat something more substantial than crackers, and helped him sort through some of the unopened mail on the table. "This one looks important," she said, holding up another hospital envelope. Henry sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I'm starting to think all they send me is bad news." "Maybe," Grace replied, "but ignoring it won't make it go away. Let's open it together." As she read the contents aloud, Henry leaned on his cane, listening quietly. The letter confirmed the need for follow-up tests and included instructions for scheduling an appointment. Grace glanced up at him. "It's nothing we can't handle. I can call them for you if you'd like." "You'd do that?" Henry asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Of course," she said. "We're a team now, remember?" Henry nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, Grace. I don't think I could do this without you. Grace smiled warmly. Good thing you don't have to. After making the call and setting up an appointment for later in the week, Grace helped Henry prepare a grocery list. She had noticed his pantry was nearly empty and insisted on taking him to the store. At first, Henry protested, but Grace's gentle persistence won out. At the grocery store, Grace watched as Henry moved slowly through the aisles, his cane tapping lightly against the tiled floor. She encouraged him to pick out fresh produce and other healthy options, subtly steering him away from the processed foods he seemed to gravitate toward. You're going to turn me into a health nut, Henry teased as she added a bag of spinach to his cart. Trust me, Grace said with a laugh. Your heart will thank me later. By the time they finished, Henry looked both tired and grateful. As they loaded the bags into the trunk of Grace's car, he turned to her. I can't remember the last time someone did so much for me. It's the least I can do, Grace replied. Besides, you've got to stick around long enough to enjoy all this healthy food. Later that week, Grace accompanied Henry to the hospital for his follow-up tests. She could see the tension in his posture as they waited, his hands gripping the arms of the chair tightly. What if it's something serious, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Then we'll face it together, Grace said, placing a comforting hand on his arm. You're not alone in this. When the doctor finally came in, his expression was professional but kind. Mr. Wallace, your test results show early signs of heart disease, he said. It's nothing we can't manage, but it will require some lifestyle changes and medication. Henry nodded slowly, his face pale. I suppose it's not the end of the world, he murmured. Not at all, the doctor said. With the right care, you'll be feeling better in no time. As they left the hospital, Henry seemed quiet but more hopeful. Grace drove him home, encouraging him to focus on the positives. This is a second chance, Henry, she said. You've got time to make changes and live a better life. You're right, he said, his voice steadier. I just need to figure out how to start. We'll take it one step at a time, Grace promised. Over the next few weeks, Grace became a regular presence in Henry's life. She helped him organize his medication, cooked meals with him, and even went on short walks around the neighborhood. Henry started to regain his strength, and with Grace's encouragement, he began opening up about his past. One evening, as they sat on his porch, he brought up Emily again. I've been thinking about her a lot lately, he said. About how much I miss her. Why don't you write to her, Grace suggested. Henry hesitated. What if she doesn't want to hear from me? You'll never know unless you try, Grace said gently. It's never too late to reach out. After a long pause, Henry nodded. You're right. I'll write to her tomorrow. As Grace drove home that night, she couldn't help but feel proud of Henry. He was making strides, both physically and emotionally, and she was honored to be part of his journey. This wasn't just about being a nurse anymore. It was about being a friend, a lifeline, and a reminder that no one had to face life's challenges alone. The next morning, Grace arrived at Henry's house to find him sitting at the dining table, a pen in hand and a blank sheet of paper in front of him. His brows were furrowed in concentration, and he tapped the pen against the table rhythmically, as though the right words were eluding him. Good morning, Henry, Grace said cheerfully, setting a bag of groceries on the counter. What's this? Are you starting your letter to Emily? Henry looked up, offering a sheepish smile. I'm trying, but it's harder than I thought. I don't know where to begin. Grace pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Why don't you start with something simple? Tell her how much you've missed her. Henry nodded, his gaze drifting back to the paper. I've thought about her every day since we stopped talking, but putting it into words feels overwhelming. Grace reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his. Just speak from the heart, Henry. She'll feel the sincerity in your words. After a moment of quiet contemplation, Henry began to write. Grace busied herself in the kitchen, giving him space but staying close enough to offer support if he needed it. Later that afternoon, as Grace and Henry walked to the mailbox together, Henry held the sealed envelope tightly in his hands. His steps were slower than usual, and Grace could sense the mixture of hope and apprehension radiating from him. "What if she doesn't respond?" Henry asked, breaking the silence. "Then at least you'll know you tried," Grace said gently. "But I have a feeling she will. Reaching out was a brave step, and I think Emily will see that." Henry nodded, exhaling deeply as he placed the letter in the mailbox. "I guess we'll see." The days that followed were a blur of activity. Grace continued to help Henry with his meals, medications, and light exercise, all while keeping him distracted from the waiting. She noticed a change in him, small but significant. He laughed more often, engaged in their conversations with greater enthusiasm, and even started taking more initiative in his daily routines. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch enjoying the crisp autumn air, Henry turned to Grace with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he began, "I've been thinking about how much you've done for me. It's not just the meals or the appointments. You've given me hope, Grace. You've reminded me that life isn't over yet." Grace smiled, touched by his words. "You've done all the hard work, Henry. I've just been here to cheer you on." "Don't sell yourself short," Henry said firmly. "I don't know where I'd be without you." A week later, as Grace arrived for her daily visit, she found Henry standing at the door, holding an envelope in his hand. His face was pale, and his hand shook slightly as he extended it toward her. "It's from Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace's heart skipped a beat. "That's wonderful, Henry. Do you want to open it together?" Henry hesitated, then nodded. "I think I need you here for this." They sat at the table, and Grace carefully opened the envelope, pulling out a neatly folded letter. She glanced at Henry, who gave her a small nod, and then began to read aloud. "Dear Dad," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've thought about you so much over the years, but I didn't know how to reach out. I've missed you more than I can say, and I've wished for a way to reconnect. Your letter meant the world to me, and I'd love to see you. Please let me know when you're ready. I'm just a phone call away." As she finished reading, Grace looked up to see tears streaming down Henry's face. He wiped them away with trembling hands, his lips quivering as he whispered, "She wants to see me." "She does," Grace said softly, her own eyes misting. "And it sounds like she's missed you just as much as you've missed her." Henry exhaled a shaky breath, a smile breaking through his tears. "I never thought I'd get this chance." The days leading up to Emily's visit were a flurry of preparation. Grace helped Henry tidy up the house, clearing away years of clutter and dusting surfaces that hadn't been touched in ages. They rearranged furniture, adding touches of warmth to the space, like fresh flowers on the dining table and family photos on the mantel. "I want everything to be perfect," Henry said one afternoon as they worked together. "She's coming to see you," Grace reminded him. "Not the house. But it's lovely that you want to make her feel welcome." When the day finally arrived, Henry was a bundle of nerves. He paced the living room, adjusted his tie multiple times, and checked the clock every few minutes. Grace gently guided him to a chair, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Take a deep breath," she said. "She'll be here soon, and everything will be just fine." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Henry froze, his eyes wide with a mix of anticipation and fear. "Go on," Grace urged with a smile. "She's waiting for you." Henry stood slowly, gripping his cane tightly as he made his way to the door. When he opened it, he was met with the sight of a woman in her early 40s, her hazel eyes and warm smile mirroring his own. "Hi, Dad," Emily said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Henry's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as tears streamed down his face. "I've missed you so much," he whispered. I've missed you too, Emily replied, her own tears falling freely. Grace watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with joy. This was the moment she had hoped for, the reunion that Henry had dreamed of but never dared to believe could happen. As father and daughter sat together, sharing stories and laughter, Grace quietly slipped out to the porch, giving them space to reconnect. She gazed out at the autumn leaves swirling in the breeze, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just a story of one man's healing journey. It was a testament to the power of kindness, the resilience of the human spirit, and the beauty of second chances. In the weeks following Emily's visit, a new energy seemed to radiate from Henry. He walked a little taller, smiled a little more, and even started taking longer strolls around the neighborhood with Grace's encouragement. His conversations were filled with stories of his daughter, her work, her hobbies, and the plans they were making to see each other again. Grace couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. Watching Henry transform from a lonely man resigned to fading into the background of life into someone vibrant and hopeful was a reminder of why she'd chosen this profession in the first place. One crisp autumn morning, Grace arrived at Henry's house with a bag of groceries in hand. She let herself in, as she often did now, and found him sitting at the dining table, a small wooden box in front of him. He looked up and smiled as she entered. "Morning," Henry, Grace said, setting the bag down on the counter. "What's in the box?" "Something I've been thinking about for a while," Henry replied, his voice carrying a quiet seriousness. "Come, sit down. I want to talk to you." Grace tilted her head, curious but slightly concerned, and took a seat across from him. "Is everything all right?" Henry nodded, his hazel eyes warm but resolute. "More than all right. And that's because of you, Grace." She blinked, taken aback. "Me? Henry, you're the one who's done the hard work. I just gave you a little nudge here and there." "No," Henry said firmly. "It's more than that. You stayed after your shift when no one else would have. You drove me home, fed me, helped me face my health issues, and most importantly, you helped me reconnect with my daughter. I didn't think I'd ever see Emily again, but because of you, I have her back in my life." Grace felt her cheeks flush. "Henry, you don't owe me anything. I did what anyone would have done." "Now that's where you're wrong," Henry said with a small smile. "What you've done for me goes beyond kindness, Grace. You've changed my life. And I want to do something to thank you properly." Before Grace could protest, Henry opened the wooden box and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the table to her. "What's this?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she picked it up. "Open it," Henry urged, his smile widening. Grace carefully opened the envelope and gasped as she saw the crisp bills inside. She counted quickly, her hands shaking slightly. "Henry, this is $5,000. "That's right," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It's yours." "Henry, I can't accept this," Grace said, shaking her head. "This is too much. You don't have to do this." "I don't have to." "I don't," Henry agreed. "But I want to." "Grace, I've been saving money for years, decades, really. Margaret and I lived simply, and after she passed, I didn't have much reason to spend it. Now I realize that holding on to it doesn't do me any good. You've given me more than I can ever repay, but this is my way of saying thank you." Grace's throat tightened as she looked at the money, then back at Henry. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept it," Henry said with a chuckle. "I know you didn't help me expecting anything in return, and that's exactly why I want to do this. You've been there for me when no one else was. You've given me hope, Grace. Let me give you something back." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. "Henry, this means so much to me, but seeing you happy, healthy, and reconnecting with Emily is worth more than any amount of money." "And that's why you deserve this," Henry said. "You've spent so much time taking care of others. Let someone take care of you for a change." Grace stared at the money for a long moment before finally nodding, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you, Henry. This is incredibly generous." "You've earned it," he replied. "And don't go spending it all on groceries for me, you hear?" Grace laughed, wiping at her eyes. I'll try my best. The gift didn't change the dynamic between them, it deepened it. Grace continued visiting Henry regularly, helping him with meals and encouraging him in his recovery. They celebrated small victories together, like the day Henry managed to walk a full mile around the block or the first time he cooked a full meal on his own. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch sipping tea, Henry turned to Grace with a thoughtful expression. You know, he said, I've been thinking about something Margaret used to say. She always believed that kindness was the most powerful force in the world. I didn't understand it fully until I met you. Grace smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. It's funny, she said, because helping you has reminded me of why I became a nurse in the first place. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the chaos and forget the impact we can have on someone's life. Well, you've made an impact, Grace Henry said, his voice steady and sincere. Not just on me, but on Emily too. She told me the other day how grateful she is to have me back in her life, and I owe that to you. Grace placed a hand on his arm, her smile growing. I think you're giving me too much credit, Henry. You're the one who wrote the letter, who faced your fears, and who made the effort to rebuild that relationship. I just helped you see that it was possible. Henry chuckled, modest as ever. But thank you, Grace, for everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the porch, Grace felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. Her journey with Henry had been unexpected, but it had become one of the most meaningful experiences of her life. Henry wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a friend, a reminder of the profound impact kindness and connection could have, and proof that even the simplest acts of compassion could change lives. As the months passed, Henry's health continued to improve. With Grace's guidance, he had adopted healthier habits, from walking daily to preparing meals that nourished his body. The loneliness that had once filled his days had been replaced with a sense of purpose, and his connection with Emily grew stronger with each conversation and visit. One chilly winter morning, Grace arrived at Henry's house to find him already dressed and waiting by the door, his cane leaning against the wall. A scarf was wrapped snugly around his neck, and his cheeks were slightly flushed from the cold air that had crept in when he opened the window earlier. Well, don't you look ready to take on the world, Grace teased, pulling off her gloves as she stepped inside. I figured I'd save you the trouble of dragging me out of the house, Henry replied with a grin. I thought we might take a walk before the snow gets too heavy. Grace glanced outside, where the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. A walk sounds perfect, she said. They strolled through the neighborhood, the snow crunching softly under their feet. Henry pointed out little details Grace hadn't noticed before: a bird's nest nestled in a tree, the way frost sparkled on the edges of the fence. It was clear he was seeing the world with fresh eyes, appreciating the beauty in the ordinary. I've been thinking about something, Henry said as they turned a corner. What's that? Grace asked, pulling her coat tighter against the chill. Henry paused, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered path ahead. I've spent so much of my life holding on to things, regrets, fears, even money. I think it's time I started letting go of some of that, doing something meaningful with what I have. Grace tilted her head, curious. What do you mean? Henry gave her a sidelong glance, his eyes twinkling. You'll see. A week later, Grace arrived at Henry's house to find him at the dining table, a stack of papers and a small ledger in front of him. He looked up with a smile as she entered. Planning another surprise, she asked, setting her bag down. You could say that, Henry replied, motioning for her to sit. I've been thinking about what you said months ago, about how it's never too late to make a difference. And I've decided it's time for me to give back in a bigger way. Grace raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? Henry pushed the papers toward her, and Grace saw that they were forms for a donation. There's a community center not far from here, he explained. They run programs for seniors, kids, and families who are struggling. I want to contribute to that. That's incredible, Henry, Grace said, her voice filled with admiration. It feels right, he said. But that's not all. I've also decided to set up a small fund for you. Grace's eyes widened. For me? Henry nodded. You've done so much for me, Grace. More than anyone ever has. And I know you're not the type to ask for anything, but I want to make sure you know how much I appreciate you. It's not just about the money, it's about recognizing what you've done for me and for Emily. Grace felt her throat tighten, her eyes misting. Henry, I don't know what to say. You've already given me so much. And you've given me back my life, Henry said simply. This is the least I can do. Over the next few weeks, Grace watched as Henry threw himself into his plans with a determination she hadn't seen before. He met with the director of the community center, toured the facilities, and made arrangements for his donation. The pride in his voice when he told Grace about their plans to expand their programs was palpable. On a snowy evening just before the holidays, Henry invited Grace and Emily to his house for dinner. The three of them sat around the table, sharing stories and laughter as the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. This feels like a dream, Henry said, his gaze shifting between Grace and Emily. A year ago, I was convinced my life was over. Now I have my daughter back, a friend who's been my anchor, and a reason to wake up every day. Emily reached across the table to squeeze his hand. We have you to thank for that, Dad. You've come so far. Grace smiled, her heart full. It's been an honor to be part of your journey, Henry. Watching you rediscover your strength has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Henry chuckled. Well, I hope you're not planning to disappear on me anytime soon. I'm not done annoying you with my stubbornness. Not a chance, Grace said with a laugh. As the evening came to an end and the snow continued to fall outside, Grace sat by the fire, listening to Henry and Emily talk about plans for the holidays. She couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed since that first night she'd seen Henry sitting alone in the hospital waiting area. Her decision to stay after her shift had been a simple act of kindness, but it had led to something extraordinary, a reminder that even the smallest gestures could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she never could have imagined. Henry had found a new lease on life. Emily had regained her father, and Grace had discovered the profound joy that came from truly connecting with another person. As she looked around the warm, cozy room, Grace realized that this wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of something beautiful, proof that compassion, patience, and hope could transform even the most ordinary days into something extraordinary. And for that, she was endlessly grateful.